is not the only child there of lesser means. So one of that school's traditions was an end-of-year formal dinner that they gave for all the seniors to be held at the local country club. This was intended to be a treat, a way of recognizing all of our accomplishments throughout the year, but it also had the feeling of a little bit of being a test, right? One chance at the end to prove that I could successfully pass in an upper-middle-class setting. And for me, as a child who grew up relatively poor, it was very, very intimidating. The formal dress requirements were intimidating. I didn't have a jacket of my own, so I would have either borrowed my dad's if it fit, or my parents would have borrowed one from a friend's family. Tying a tie, super intimidating, total nightmare actually. Not a lot of practice tying a tie when I was growing up. And then once you get to the country club, there remains the obstacle course of the dinner table itself, right? Each pristine place setting laid out with exacting care and formality, and beside each plate standing guard just a bewildering array of forks and knives and spoons, each one mocking me, right? And pick a fork up tentatively, and it's like it said to me, "Oh really? You're going to use me to eat the salad? Oh, are you really?" Now, my parents had raised me with manners, thank you very much. I knew elbows off the table. I knew don't reach across someone's plate. I knew please pass the asparagus. Don't wipe your fingers on the dog. I knew how to delicately spit out half-chewed asparagus into a napkin, discreetly. I knew the basics. But that array of forks and knives and spoons, so many courses, each with its assigned implement, so many opportunities to guess wrong, to betray one's ignorance, to not pass the test, to be out of place. This did not feel like the welcoming table, right? This felt like trial by salad fork. Now, as I mentioned, I was not the only child who was poised to fail this test. So as it happens, early on in the dinner, we realized that no matter what utensil we used, whenever the waiter came by to clear a course, he would take the one that we were supposed to use, even if it was not the one we had actually used in our botched attempts to be fancy. So what you did was, as soon as the course was changing, you kind of looked down to see what he took from the plate way down there, and then you grab that, dirty up really quickly in your potatoes or whatever, and it would look like you had used it all along. Now, I don't know what the point of that was really, right? I probably didn't think that he was going to be asked for a full fork report later on by the powers that be. I just knew that at that time, I wanted the waiter at least to think that I belonged there. Now, last year we spent a lot of time talking about the past of Unitarian Universalism, reviewing the themes and the ideas and the principles of our religion as they've changed and developed throughout the last 200 years or so. And for this new church year, I want us to turn from the past more towards the present and the future. Right, talk less about what it used to mean to be UU, and more about what it means right now to be UU. And talk less about abstract principles and more about their concrete applications, how we live our values. In a series of online essays, the Reverend Tom Shade posed that question as, what kind of virtues do we seek to embody as Unitarian Universalists? If we didn't teach 7 abstract principles, but rather encouraged one another to live out certain positive character traits, what would those character traits be? And which got me thinking about, how would we translate our 7 principles into those positive virtues? What are the virtues associated with this foundation of our religion? So when we think about our first principle, we affirm and promote the inherent worth and dignity of each person. The virtue that kind of springs immediately to my mind is tolerance, right? Which is a virtue. It's certainly not a bad thing to be a tolerant person. That's a good liberal value. Not liberal like politics, but liberal like liberal religion. Certainly we don't want to be intolerant. But I think tolerance falls a little flat as a virtue when you're talking about a religious community, right? I tolerate you is a pretty weak statement. I tolerate you, man. I really, really tolerate you. Thanks, man. I tolerate you too. So then I thought about this concept of welcoming as being a more active embodiment of the virtue that we're looking for. If we believe that every person has worth and dignity, we acknowledge that worth and dignity by being a welcoming presence to them, by being open to honest engagement with the individuals who cross our path, which means we invite them into our space just as they are. We are fully present to them, and we allow them to matter in the time that we share with them, to be important to us and us to be important to them, for us to really connect and risk changing one another. We can do that as individuals in our daily lives, or we can do that as a church community welcoming the larger community. Now, the simple concept of welcoming people, in particular welcoming someone to your table, as our reading's been talking about, that can be a very powerful act, a transformative, even a subversive act. In our second reading from the book Jesus Before Christianity by Albert Nolan, the author talked about how shocking it was to the people of Jesus' time. Shocking that he chose to invite the poor and the dispossessed, the marginalized and the sinful, to his table. It was shocking from the perspective of Roman society, because in that society, status was everything, and status was brutally enforced. Right? There was patrician and plebe, patron and client, slave and free, citizen and alien, man and woman, each in a position of power or subjugation, enforced by social norm, and occasionally a little violence in that society. Jesus disregarded all those hierarchies, and he chose to mix with the lowest of the low classes, with the penniless, with the slave, with criminals, with women. Now, in Jewish society at that time, ritual purity was the driving segregator of people. And Jesus was mixing with people who were not just of low status, but were sinners, and therefore were ritually unclean. He was literally defiling himself by allowing these people to interact with him and touch him in particular. In Luke chapter 7, verse 36, he's dining with a woman who was a sinner, and she's coming to his home and she's anointing him with oil. He happens also to be dining with a Pharisee, as he did. And the Pharisee who sees this woman touching his feet is completely aghast. And he is reported to have thought to himself, I have no idea how we know this, but he is reported to have thought to himself, if this man were a prophet, he would have known who and what sort of woman this is who is touching him, for she is a sinner. In other words, she is ritually unclean, and Jesus should not even be touching her or allowing her to touch him. Now, I'm going to digress just briefly, just a second, because it's often asked, what is the relationship of Jesus to Unitarian Universalism? That's a question that people often have. And what do you think about Jesus? And so if there are any visitors here today, I'm just going to touch on this very briefly. Unitarian Universalism grew out of two different Christian heresies. The first one, denying that Jesus was the same as God. And the second one, affirming that everyone goes to heaven regardless of their relationship with Jesus. Those are our past ideas about him. Today, UUs have many different ideas about Jesus and many different levels of interest in him. Some UUs self-identify as Christians, and Jesus is at the absolute center of their spiritual life. Other UUs, not so much. Perhaps most commonly, he is raised up as an example of a great moral exemplar and a great ethical teacher. When it comes to his practice of radical hospitality, I would say he was a moral visionary. The ancient world, excepting perhaps the Stoics, didn't have really a concept of universal brotherhood and universal sisterhood. The idea of the inherent worth and dignity of all people was not operative. Life was brutal, life was cheap, and huge numbers of people were granted no dignity, no value at all. By specifically seeking out and welcoming to his table these people who would be unwelcome in every other dignified home, people who did not count for anything, Jesus was granting them worth and dignity to people who could never have it. The scholar John Dominic Crosson, he puts this subversion of social values, this upending of hierarchies at the very center of Jesus' ministry, at the very heart of his life and mission. That's how central he thinks it is, and how radical an act it would have been perceived, even if you took away every other thing that Jesus said and did. That alone was completely radical and revolutionary in his society. Theologian Walter Casper observes that in the East, even today, to share a meal with someone is a guarantee of peace, trust, brotherhood, and forgiveness. The shared table is a shared life. In Judaism, fellowship at table had the special meaning of fellowship in the sight of God. Each person at the table ate a piece of broken bread and thus received a share in the blessing spoken by the master of the house over the whole loaf. Now, what I particularly like about this form of Jesus' ministry, and this is something that I hadn't really noticed until Nolan pointed it out, is that Jesus doesn't just dine with the oppressed. He doesn't just break bread with the sinful. He parties with them. Right? These are parties. These are joyous occasions. When they talk about what these meals look like, they use the Roman word recline, which is what you did at a feast, at a party. They're reclining on couches. There's so much wine flowing and good food going around that Jesus has to answer critics who call him a drunkard and a glutton. That's how much he's getting down with the dispossessed. It's giving him a bad reputation around town. I love that. These aren't meals where he's condescending to the people that he's inviting to them. He's not trying to elevate them. He's not trying to instruct them or save them. He's just celebrating life with them. And in doing so, he's forging a real human connection with them. And to me, these meals are practically performance art theater of radical love and equality. So, the welcoming table and the unwelcoming table. Welcoming as an act of positive virtue, as a way that we can live out our UU ideas. I want to raise just a few points that are specifically germane to UU churches, because the concepts we've been talking about so far are sort of broad and general and universally applicable. So here I'm going to get a little more specific. So first, we've talked about the welcome table. Let's talk about where we sit at the unwelcoming table. We try very hard to be welcoming here at UUI. For example, we are a designated welcoming congregation, which means we celebrate the presence of lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender people. And when I read online or talk to people about what are the kinds of experiences that make them feel unwelcome when they enter a Unitarian Universalist church, when I try to get a sense of where we sometimes fall short in offering a welcoming table, what I hear about most often or read about most often is not issues about race or LGBT. It's issues about class, and particularly the intersection of class and politics. And, we're a pretty homogenous group. There's not that many of us. There's about 150,000 that actually come to churches. So that's tiny. And being pretty homogenous means that there can be unspoken assumptions about the kind of people who are going to come to our table. And generally speaking, it's college-educated, middle-class, political liberals who appreciate the arts. Not that there's anything wrong with that. And so I read things online like, I love my UU church. I love my UU church, but I would not bring my brother-in-law with me. I would not introduce my brother-in-law to the congregation that I love because he's a truck driver and he dropped out of high school, and the first question they're going to ask him is, so where did you go to college? And it's going to make him feel embarrassed. I don't want that for him. Or I read my uncle's all about NASCAR, and I don't know who he's going to talk to at social hour, and maybe he's going to feel, kind of made fun of or ostracized. Or oftentimes I'm a Republican, and I overhear a lot of nasty comments about Republican over here and over here. and I would be afraid to tell people what I really think about this issue, and I don't think anyone wants to hear it anyway. Or the young adult, true story, who was complaining online that they were chastised in church by an older member because she admitted that she liked to watch Keeping Up with the Kardashians. That was just right. Okay, so I'm not going to play the scold all morning, right? Occupational hazard of standing up here as you start scolding people. I'm not going to do that. I sincerely believe that we try very hard to be welcoming here at UUI and at all Unitarian Universalist churches. And we know our religion is bigger than who you voted for, or whether you listen to NPR, or whether you shop at Walmart. But everyone falls short of their aims sometimes. So I just wanted to draw attention to those areas where we do sometimes as a denomination fall short of being as welcoming as we would like to be, just so we can be mindful. Okay, my next UU specific point. And this is really a follow-up point to the sermon that I gave a few weeks ago about the new Jim Crow, the book by Michelle Alexander. That sermon talked about the mass incarceration of Americans, particularly people of color, swept up into our prisons as part of the war on drugs, many or even most for nonviolent offenses. And Michelle Alexander describes how people who are labeled as felons, people who have done time, they feel shame and they feel a loss of dignity. There's an idea, I guess, that maybe it's somehow like a badge of honor in poor neighborhoods that you served time, that you got arrested, whatever. And she says, that's a false idea. That is not true. People don't brag about going to prison in poor neighborhoods. They don't celebrate it. Of course they don't. They hide it. They don't talk about it. So when you talk about the list of problems that people face who have served time in prison, like their loss of civil rights, like being almost permanently unemployable, you have to add to that list social stigma, isolation, alienation, shame, loss of dignity. Their situation really mirrors the situation of the dispossessed in Jesus' time in a lot of ways. They're not just poor or powerless, they're outcast and less than. They're unclean. Alexander theorizes, actually, that one of the reasons the civil rights movement, the organized civil rights movement, was sort of slow to respond to this crisis of mass incarceration as it was happening, is precisely because no one really wants to be the face of crack dealers and meth heads. Right? That's not a public relations angle that you seek out. It's more comfortable to be the face of the problems of rising minority middle class rather than a sinking criminal class. To champion young lawyers rather than young car thieves. That's her speculation. But the point is an important one, so I wanted to draw it to your attention a little bit today, because we need to start thinking about it. And as a society, we need to start talking about it. We are the most incarcerated nation on earth. Most incarcerated nation on earth. And as a consequence of our approach to law and order, there are literally millions of felons in our society, who number among the poor and the dispossessed. Somehow these people have to be brought back to the table. They have to be brought back to the welcoming table. They have to be reintegrated into the community. They have to be restored to dignity, to full dignity. And that means that as a part of rethinking our policies of mass incarceration, part of dealing with the effects of those policies, we're going to have to examine our own thoughts and feelings about the victims of those policies. We have to re-examine our own thoughts and feelings about people who have been labeled as felon, as ex-convict, as criminal, because they have to be brought back to the welcome table. My last thought for the day. And this is really an extension of the idea that welcoming can be a positive virtue. It can be a practice for living out our values or enhancing our lives. And the thought was, and this just kind of popped into my head one day, what if I treated everyone I interacted with in my life as if they were an honored guest at my table? The table of my life, as it were. So, what if I treated everyone who came into my cubicle, who came into my checkout line, my 3 feet of sidewalk space, my personal space, the lane that I'm driving in, what if I treated them as if I had just invited them into my home? Right? When someone is a guest at our table, when someone is a guest at our home, we know how to behave, right? There are protocols that engage. Because we want to treat people who are guests in such a way that honors both their dignity and the dignity of our home and our table. We're attentive to their needs. We listen graciously. We neaten up the space a little bit, right? Dust off some cobwebs, get out some books, spread out the Scientific American, right? And what if we engaged with everyone that way? So you are an honored guest that I am welcoming into my life for this stretch of time. I'm going to treat you as an honored guest. Now, that doesn't mean that we have to be stiff and uptight, right? I mean, Jesus partied with the sinners, and so can we. And that doesn't mean we have to be pushovers or nicey nice. Because sometimes in life, you have to disinvite a guest from your home, right? It happens. But even then, you don't send them away screaming like throwing pots and pans at them. You disinvite them in such a way that honors their dignity and the dignity of your own. Wendell Berry said, "We clasp the hands of those that go before us and the hands of those who come after us. We enter the little circle of each other's arms and the larger circle of all creatures. We all want to belong. We all want to feel our own worth and dignity, and we all want to feel like we have a place at the table. And so in honor of our first principle, the inherent worth and dignity of each person, I invite you to go out and make the world a more welcoming place." Blessed be. Would you please rise and bow to your spirit for our closing hymn, number 131 in your gray hymnal, Love Will Guide Us.